you going to jump right in? Or are you going to like introduce this whole thing? Or are you just going to go?
I'm just going to wing it.
All right. I love it.
Here we go. Hey everybody, it's Dave Dugdale, learningvideo.com. This is James Drake. You've seen him on my channel before. It's not going to be like a comprehensive review. We're just going to basically ramble. I don't know how long this video is going to be, but it's on the GH5. I've used it, and I mostly wanted to look at the whole concept of is 8-bit better than 10-bit, because this does both, and my cameras, the Sony cameras, do 8-bit. So that's basically what I wanted to get out of this. So I didn't review this at all, really. I just looked at that one aspect. Whereas James, and I don't even know what James did yet. So he just walked in the door. I was like, let's turn the camera on and let's just go. So I've got a bunch of notes on my end, but I don't know if you wanted to start or what you wanted to say about the camera.
Sure. Well, I'll just talk about my approach. For me, I'm always in the market of trying to figure out, is the next camera the right one to switch to? And, you know, there's a lot of factors that go into whether a camera is the right one for you or not. Some of those factors for me were, and just to preface, I did shoot quite a lot of the GH4 and multiple GH4s and stuff like that.
You owned a GH4 for a bit.
Yeah.
Like I did. I owned it for about a year.
So for me, I liked the GH4. I didn't love it. I liked the feature, the spec sheet, if you will, as far as the 4K was great, but it had some issues that were hard to get around, like the low light. Even when they added the V-Log to it, it felt really noisy in the shadows, which makes you scared to use V-Log unless it's like a bright sunny day, which is not every scene you're shooting. Yeah. So ultimately, even though they had the V-Log, it wasn't quite the right fit. With this camera, one thing I was really interested in was, did that improve? Did they figure out something on the sensor to increase the sensitivity of it so there's less shadow noise in the shadows? Yep. And will that make it usable? And from the tests I did, I mean, I was actually really impressed.
Oh, cool.
Like, it's much cleaner.
Because I didn't run any low light tests at all.
Sure.
I didn't do any of that.
And I put it up against, I have a C100, which obviously is a little bit of a different animal, but it's amazing in low light. So I kind of pitted the GH5 and the C100. And the C100 was better, but it's also 1080p. It's not a 4K image.
Right.
And it's also a bigger sensor, and some of the lenses are a little bit faster, so it's an unfair fight. I will say, overall low light is much improved over the GH4, though.
Oh,
like,
good.
I was afraid to go 800 ISO in the GH4.
Before, yeah.
And on this one, I actually felt good up to about 1600. Yeah. So those are great things.
I remember when I had it, the GH4, I was like, I didn't really want to go above like 1250 or what, you know.
I mean, it's definitely no Sony A7S, but it's like much better.
Right now, I think I'm at ISO 1000 on this camera right now, and I'm like, I didn't even
clean as a whistle.
Didn't even think about it. I was just like 1000.
And that's where it's going. I mean, ultimately, it won't matter.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think overall, feature-wise, I was excited about the V-Log, and I thought it was much cleaner. Which, you know, what ends up happening when you have cleaner shadows is you start shooting to the left. You know, you start shooting more into the shadows to protect those highlights. The one disappointment of the camera was, of course, the highlights. And we had done some tests here before I took it. And I was like, man, maybe it's recording super whites, or maybe there's like some way to eke out just that little bit more out of the high end. And from my experience, it kind of felt like the tonality's great. It's all kind of in there in the image, but once it hits that highlight, it just feels like a shelf,
you know? Hard boom.
And that's really unfortunate. I mean, I wish, even if the dynamic range wasn't amazing, I wish the roll-off was better, you know? But it feels very video at that roll-off.
And you're talking within V-Log.
Within V-Log. Yeah. And what was interesting was switching back and forth to even say the standard profile and dialing the contrast all the way down. Going back and forth between the two, I didn't see any new information in V-Log in the highlights, which you kind of would hope that there would be. Like, that's part of the purpose of shooting it. And so, I don't know. I started off not liking the camera, and then I shot with it a bit and was reviewing the footage, and then liked it again because it's so flexible. And if you're really careful about the highlights, everything else is great. The 10-bit 4K is amazing. And it's intra, so it plays back well in the computer. You're not sitting there rendering. And, I mean, overall, like, it has a great image, the vlog. It's just those darn highlights, man.
Just they're hard clipped. Interesting. And on my end, if you've come here from another video, what I did is I published, and if you haven't seen that video, I'll put a link to it somewhere, card or whatever. Basically, I did test this camera, 10-bit, 4K, and I pitted it against like the camera that I'm filming with right now. It's the A6500 in 8-bit 4K. And basically, if you've watched that video already, they're like the same.
So hard to tell.
So hard to tell. In fact, I had one of the Panasonic reps came to my house and he watched the actual footage of it, and he's like looking at it is like, yeah, it's really hard to tell the difference between the two.
The only thing I saw was the compression, but that's not what we're talking about, right? You're talking about the banding.
Banding, right? Yeah.
I saw compression, which are obviously different numbers, but as far as the banding and the color grades you did, like, yeah.
Yeah, because they matched up pretty well. I mean, they're kind of different on their gamma curves. Mm-hmm. The Sony, for some reason, always records like if you were to shoot a chart like this, this middle gray on the Sonys is always low. It's compared to like Canon and even Panasonic, they raise their up a little bit. So like skin tones are usually, you grade it differently. But I was able to match them up pretty well. But I guess overall what I say is if you watch that video and you're like, Dave doesn't know what he's doing, or that kind of thing. Basically, I will say yes, 10-bit is better than 8-bit when you're shooting in 1080 on all the cameras that I've ever tested. Like I've tested like the FS5 and like, this camera and stuff like that. I've run tests and taken, the same content and applied the same like really harsh grade on them. And the 8-bit breaks apart faster than the 10-bit. But when you go to 4K, I can't find any difference. And I'm pushing the grades pretty hard, like in that video. But I just want to say that if I had this camera for, let's say 6 months to a year, and I kept shooting, I would probably run into a clip or a situation where I'd be like, I finally see the difference. But it might be one clip out of 10,000 that you shoot, and you might I finally see a difference.
Right.
I would think it's probably there. Mathematically, it should be there. And I want to say too, I'm not a professional colorist.
Sure.
I'm not one of these guys, and I wish a professional colorist would actually do that video.
Yeah.
Do a video like I just did and really push it hard.
Yep.
But if you go back and watch that video, I couldn't see any difference.
Yeah. Well, in your defense, Dave, you should check out his color matching course or video.
Of course, yeah.
It's amazing. So great job matching the cameras.
Hey,
like
thanks.
To my eye, I couldn't even tell which one was which. So props, because that's actually like fairly hard to do when you have different technologies and stuff. So I thought that was really neat. The one thing I was going to say is I think the one factor that always plays into the color grading is the bit rate. Mm-hmm. You always run into that compression.
Right.
And for me, using that 4K 10-bit file, I'm looking at it on this like 30-inch screen, like really eyeing the details in full 4K. The part or the file broke apart when you just, here's a test you can do. You can just max the saturation, max the vibrance, like if you're using Adobe, and you can start to see where the compression comes apart in the blues and the reds. You start seeing the blockiness. But I think, and I'm not an expert on this particular technology, but I think you're actually seeing the limits of the compression, not necessarily the lack of levels of color.
Okay.
So, I'm not 100% sure on that, but I'm like fairly certain that, if it was, say, 1,000 megabit per second codec or whatever.
Right.
Because when I relate it to, say, shooting a still on a 5D, a raw still, you can do anything to that. I mean, you can take red and make it green,
right,
and there's no weird compression interpolation problems because it's just raw data. It's not compressed. So my thinking is, when I was able to get it to break down finally, and it was extreme. I mean, you would really have to go like crazy 80s music video or something. I think it's the limit of the compression, not so much the 8-bit, 10-bit.
Okay.
But that's what
Well, when you compare this one, this is 400 megabit at its best codec. Like the Shogun that I were pointing to, you can see out of the frame, you guys can't see it. At 4K, it's rolling 700 meg.
Okay.
Now your red, when it shoots compressed raw, what's the bit rate on that? Do you know?
Well, the red code compression is brilliant because it's dynamic. And you can choose anything depending on the speed of your red mag. This is kind of complicated answer, but you can go from, say, 3 to 1, which is basically a third of the original file size.
Right.
So at 5K, say it's like a 26 megabyte picture. At 3 to 1, you're like 8 megabytes a frame, basically.
Okay.
So times 24, that's what, 190 megabytes or something per second? Megabytes, not megabits.
Okay.
So it'd be 1900. Is that right?
Something.
At the least compression, it'd be 1900.
But you never shoot that way. You're like 5 to 1.
No, I always shoot at like 8 to 1 or 10 to 1.
Okay. Which brings
if
it
it's
down.
a higher resolution. I mean, again, it's like a complicated answer because red, you kind of finesse your way into figuring out what you like to do with it. If you're shooting 5K, you can shoot less compression because you're downsampling to 4K or 1080 or whatever. If you're shooting 4K, I've found that it's always better to shoot with less compression. So like a 5 or a 6 to 1.
So I guess my question is, looking at the footage from the GH5 versus your red, and when you push the red a lot, because you've done over the years, is this the GH5 falling apart faster than your red? Yeah,
it does fall. It does
in
fall
terms
apart.
of that, and not in terms of like the banding, but in terms of like the artifacts that you see.
Right. Yeah. And again, it's a little bit of an unfair fight because the red is doing debayering on your computer. So kind of like you're shooting a raw still, you're shooting raw video. It's a compressed raw, but the point is that your computer's actually changing the color information, whereas on this, it's all baked in. Okay. Even though it's vlog, even though it's flat, that's a baked in flat.
Okay.
On the red, you can dynamically change your gamma curve from flat to extreme with no loss in information. So that's really where you make your gain on that post process, is because the computer's not artificially creating red as red. It's like, well, that red maybe is pink or it's teal or whatever.
Yeah.
That allows you to go much further without breakdown. So bitrate wise, it's like a hard thing to compare because it's actually like different methodology. I think that this camera, the GH5, is approaching becoming a perfect camera for its form factor and its style. If you're okay with micro four thirds, that is. But I think the one thing that holds me back on it is the dynamic range. And I know that sounds silly, but there's a level of comfort you want to have that you can just shoot into scenes and not be worried about how bad that window is going to look later, or why is their hair slightly blown out in this shot.
Yeah.
And those are just like minute things that end up being a really big deal for the many run and gun situations you may or may not end up in.
I want to talk about the video that you might have watched that I already did, the comparison video. What I had to do with that is actually I exported it many different ways out of Resolve, but Resolve doesn't have H.265 yet. You can export it in a lot of different formats, but I was trying many different tests to make it export so it wasn't banding. So what I was seeing in Resolve on my computer looked clean, perfectly fine, but when I rendered out to the H.265, I was like, oh, I can see banding. And then you upload it to YouTube, and I was like, oh, I see even more banding. So what I had to actually do is export it as like an AVI file, like uncompressed, totally uncompressed, wickedly large file, right? Just for that 5-minute video. And then I used a program called like FFmpeg, a kind of a paid version of that. And I created the H.265 from that. And when I looked at the actual output rendered of the H.265, it was clean. And then when you upload it to YouTube, especially when you'll notice if you go back and watch that video, when I did those transitions from like the vlog natural to vlog graded, and I'm transitioning through like several seconds, you will see those bands happen. I just want to say that I did not see that on my computer at all.
Yeah. It was a generational loss. You're watching it at a loss, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Good old YouTube.
Thanks, YouTube.
But I will say when you encode it in H.265 and then you upload it with the 4K, YouTube takes a look at it, and then when they retranscode it, they put it in their VP9 codec. So you actually, if you've never tried this, you can actually go to a YouTube video, right-click on it, go down to the bottom, and it says Stats for Nerds. And if in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see a bunch of stats. And if one says VP9, then that's like the highest quality that I know of. Although I was talking to Matt Fraser, Panasonic, I think he talked about another one where when you enable HDR content, it goes even a step beyond that. It's a different type of VP9. There's like some VP9 something version, whatever. And then it's like, I forget what he said. It was like really, really high quality. All right, this is pretty much the conclusion. One thing I want to mention to put this kind of in perspective is over the years I've done this is like the third or fourth attempt that I've done comparing 8-bit versus 10-bit. And every time I've done it, I've like sent it over to some of the professional colors forums where those guys hang out, and I'll publish a video and they'll like tear it to shreds. You're like, oh, you did the test wrong, or you did that, it's too complicated, blah blah blah. And they're like, these are little toy cameras. You go to those forums, they call these toy cameras. That's what they call them. The other ones are like big boy pants cameras, kind of thing. But what I thought was very interesting this time when I published that video on the colors forum, nobody ripped it to shreds. Nobody said, no, I can see the difference, or blah, blah, blah. None of them said, I did anything wrong, or like, they just basically kept quiet. They're like, they didn't say anything.
The silence was deafening.
So I don't know if I was doing it right, or nobody was listening that day or something, but I thought that was kind of interesting. Do you have anything you want to conclude with on this camera?
I mean, it's a great buy. Amazing job, Panasonic. If you can figure out the highlight roll-off thing in Vlog, I think you'll sell that many more cameras.
And the yellowish skin tones.
Yeah. And to me, the yellowish skin tones thing isn't as big of an issue because of the Vlog, because of that flexibility. So you're able to modify it. If you spend a little bit of time and developed your own LUTs that you like to work with, I don't know that would even really be too much of an issue.
Okay.
So I think all around, the stabilizing with prime lenses is awesome. Yeah. The low light's much improved. It's not A7S or even C100 territory, but it's much improved over the GH4.
Yeah, got a great battery.
And
you got a great screen.
The battery's improved.
If you're a vlogger, come on.
Flip the screen. Yeah, overall, it's an excellent camera. And they even make that professional attachment now, right? That hooks into this and gives you XLR inputs.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
So if you're in need of that, they even make their own accessory. You don't have to go to Juiced Link anymore or whatever.
Yeah, that kind of just sits right on top.
Yeah.
Sony's got a solution as well. All right. I think we're done.
I think we did it. If you're still watching, Dave Dugdale will give you a camera.